Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, September 30th, 2025, and our friend Patrick Henningsen joins us. Welcome, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Nima.
Patrick, what's going on right now in the Middle East is a huge concern. It seems that the aerial refueling tankers that entered Europe from the United States in the past 2 days are now on their way to the Middle East, and some of them have already arrived at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar,
Mm.
and they were carrying fighter jets alongside them. It seems that as we were talking before coming up, you mentioned that the meeting between Hexet and generals and admirals can be related to what's going on in the Middle East. Your take on that?
Yes, that's right, Nima. The big news in the United States for the last couple of days, and I saw this headline coming through the Washington Post. I saw all the media outlets reporting it, and looked a bit strange. For the last 3 days, they say Pete Hegseth having an unprecedented meeting of U.S. generals. They don't know what they were going to be talking about, what the agenda was going to be. And then we see another sort of leak or a release of some information last night saying that it's about DEI and Hegseth putting an end to wokeness in the Pentagon, and we're done with that and so forth. That got a lot of headlines, and of course the Democrats latched on to that as well as the left-wing mainstream press. And it looks like I thought it was a cover for something, and it certainly looks like potentially is cover for what you're just describing here, which is a military buildup and escalation for an attack on Iran. What the timeline for that is, we don't know, but there's just this rush. If you noticed as well, Nima, there was a rush to push forward a peace plan by the Trump administration, a Hamas latest ceasefire plan, and it specifically featured Qatar, which was interesting. And they offered Qatar, amnesty, if you will, or there'll be no aggression. They'll allow Hamas leaders to leave Gaza, and they could go to Qatar so long as they don't promote violence and so forth. And so it was basically one of these deals, these typical Israeli deals, which the U.S. are now doing, which Trump is doing, the Israeli-style negotiation tactic, which is to construct some kind of a negotiations deal that's totally unattainable, that nobody will all agree to on all these different third and fourth parties. And then when it does break down, then the Israelis or the U.S. turn around and say, we have a perfectly good deal, but the other side didn't accept it, and we're going to go ahead and bomb again. And so that's always been the Israeli tactic, to stall and buy time in order to change facts on the ground. And they really want to get this Gaza situation finished. And they can't do it just by bombing and killing every single last inhabitant in the Gaza Strip. They were trying to see if there was a way they could coax Hamas, coax the Palestinians into some kind of an interim arrangement, and where they would disarm Hamas, and that they would no longer, the leaders would leave the Gaza Strip. And I have to tell you that even if the Palestinians were naive or dumb enough to comply with a deal like this, you could be certain that Israel will target and try to kill and assassinate every last Hamas person that left the Gaza Strip, no matter what country they're in. And they've already proven that they're willing and able to do that. So whatever promises are made by the U.S. and Israel to the Palestinians, that, if you just accept this, and then, we'll start a new interim a government, a kind of Tony Blair-led, colonial viceroy administrative government, and everything's going to be fine. We promise we won't attack. I honestly, if you think you can trust the Israelis, that they're not going to continue to bomb or attack, that would just be so foolish. I can't see the Palestinians doing that, but they'll use this. The Israelis and the Americans and the Trump administration will use this by saying, look, we tried, we gave them a perfect deal, and they just rejected it. So they kind of deserve what's coming to them now, bombs away. But bombs away, it won't be quick enough to fast track a war with Iran before Christmas. And Trump really wants to do this before Christmas, I think. And Israel, well, let's say Israel wants it done before Christmas. Trump does what Israel wants. That's my read on it.
Do you feel that if they attack Iran, Israelis attack Iran, Europe, together with the United States, maybe Canada, Australia, New Zealand, these countries are going to join? Or how? Because somehow I feel that Europe is so much involved in the conflict in Ukraine. So coming to the conflict with Iran, it's somehow something beyond the Europe's capabilities. But when it comes to the situation in Gaza, in my opinion, as you mentioned, is the main point to distract people from what's going on in Gaza and just going on with the plan, just destroying everything, removing people from Gaza. I think Iran is being used so far as a distraction, beyond having those sort of mindset that regime change in Iran may change the whole face of the Middle East, all of that. But they're using the attack on Iran as a leverage, as some sort of distraction to what's going on in Gaza.
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely a great distraction to turn the world's eyes away from an ongoing genocide, which is one of the worst crimes against humanity ever committed in living memory in front of the world before their eyes. So that's for certain. Whether the Europeans will be involved in any attack on Iran, the only thing that could assure that would be some kind of a false flag attack on European soil, in which they would blame Iran or blame Hezbollah or blame something that they could tie to Iran. And then the European leaders are naive and stupid enough to get themselves pulled into that sort of situation. But it's only for show. It's only kind of a fig leaf for a coalition that's not really a coalition. And the U.S. did this with Iraq as well, the coalition of the willing. And they, slapped together these coalitions in order to give the lead powers legitimacy. That's what these coalitions are for. But you can be sure that Britain will be going in, because the British military establishment, they look at all of these altercations as opportunities to get involved, so that their military industrial complex can remain relevant, so that their command and their status within NATO as number 2 in the NATO command hierarchy remains solidified, that their intelligence services get involved and get experience. So they need to be involved in everything the U.S. is involved in order to stay up to date and relevant. It's almost like live training, if you will, even though they're not making a huge impact often on the actual battlefield. Britain's always there. So that keeps their whole shtick going as a sort of, second tier superpower. But it is mainly a U.S. unilateral action, and with the Israelis, of course. And so this coalition of Israel and the U.S., this is being sold. It's an effective sales pitch to the Trump base, mostly to the MAGA base. Although the part of the MAGA base Trump's base is peeling off on the issue of Israel, similar to how Charlie Kirk, the late conservative activist, was veering away from the Israel issue. This is a big problem within the Trump base. But see, with America, you have to understand the psychology. The public psychology is, once America is engaged in a war, it's viewed as unpatriotic not to support that war, even if that war is illegal, even if that war is waged on a false pretense, even if it's waged on a complete lie like WMDs in Iraq, that most Americans will fall in line, even on the left. They'll fall in line for fear of being accused of being anti-American or not patriotic during a time of war. So that's the phenomenon. And, the U.S. establishment always banks on that. So as long as they can get involved and at least sell it out the gates, sell it right in the beginning, the first couple of days. And if it's plausible enough to make a mainstream narrative for the major networks and for the White House and Washington, and then once it's in motion, it doesn't matter what a debacle it turns out being. It's somewhat legitimized just because America's already deeply involved in it. So, but is Iran the same as Iraq? Absolutely not. Iran's capabilities are far beyond anything that the former Iraqi Republican Guard ever dreamed they could ever have. And so if Scud missiles, Saddam's Scud missiles were enough to terrorize Israel and the American public, what will come as a result of the aggression on Iran will probably be a resumption of heavy damage in Tel Aviv. So we can talk about the tactics and the strategy in terms of defending Israel there. But I don't know how this will end up. I don't know how far this is going to extend. Certainly, Yemen would be part of this as well, in both directions, and that's something to consider. So that's interesting. And Qatar, of course, is very key. They're a key staging ground for the U.S. military, for reconnaissance, for the U.S. and the British, flying rivet fighters and AWACS, pulling data in, and also providing the broader defense umbrella for Israel. Israel's defense umbrella in the event of a missile attack extends all the way from the Red Sea all the way to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, all the way to north to Azerbaijan, and even to Turkey, to Incirlik Air Force Base, to Cyprus, and also U.S. naval assets parked in the Mediterranean, and even to parts of Egypt where the U.S. have some facilities as well. But that's how big the defense security envelope is for Israel. That's what it requires to defend that little tiny country called Israel. It takes all of that, all of those U.S. bases, all of those naval and air assets, all of those troops and facilities and allies in the region, which is, if you think about it, it's absolutely incredible what it takes, the amount of heavy lifting it takes to defend this little country, Israel, that's currently waging war against at least 1, 2, 3, 4, or has waged war 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, possibly 6 countries in its neighboring region, which, if you think about that, that's also incredible.
I think when it comes to defending Israel, from what we've seen in the first conflict between the two countries, direct conflict between Iran and Israel, we saw that the air defense system didn't work. And Iran easily can saturate the Israeli airspace. And that's why I think on the other hand, Iran is able to hit all of these bases, US bases, including Diego Garcia. And we know that Diego Garcia doesn't have air defense system sufficient to defend itself. That's huge. I don't know why they're doing this. That's why I'm talking. It seems to me that they know what would be the outcome, but they want it so desperately. And do you think that this time around we're gonna have Germany on the part of Israel? Because Merz said recently that they're doing our dirty job, and I don't know if they're gonna actively join Israel in this attack.
No, Germany can't. It's the U.S. and Israel. I mean, what the Europeans will do is snapback sanctions this week. So those have come into play. The snapback sanctions deadline passed this week. So for the Europeans' part, they will be, economic sanctions on Iran. That's a big signal as well. Based on what? That they're, violating the JCPOA. Europe didn't fulfill its obligations for the original JCPOA in terms of sanctions relief and and money that was due to Iran and so forth. And the United States, the main party, unilaterally withdrew in I believe May 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's why the agreement collapsed.
2017, if I'm not mistaken.
2017, yeah, during Trump, the first year of Trump's presidency. So I mean, to still be blaming Iran for being derelict on their obligations for the nuclear deal for many Europeans it just shows you how corrupt and what lapdogs the European leaders have become to the United States and to Israel And I think it's that combination of Israel and the United States that is basically holding these European leaders hostage, if you will. I mean, they may or may not want to support Israel to that just insane, gratuitous degree, which they are, and opposing Iran on the basis of that's what the U.S. and Tel Aviv want. But if you took Israel out of the picture, probably the European countries would be arguing with, or at least negotiating or opposing the United States on this Iranian issue. I'm sure of it. But the Zionist lobby has such a stranglehold now over most European countries. I mean, we're talking about thousands of NGOs, thousands of lobbying groups, thousands of organizations that have been constructed just in Europe and the UK alone. I'm not even talking about the United States. And that's the sort of ecosystem, if you will, the soft power ecosystem that the Israeli and the sort of world Jewish community has constructed in order that Israel gets what it wants. So just so they'll do their part on the sanctions, and I think the big risk here, I think, is going to be, one of them is, what role will Azerbaijan play in an attack on Iran, and what about Iraqi Kurdistan, the KRG? What role are they going to play, and what role will Syria play, the new Syria under Jolani, which isn't really a proper country at the moment, but with the former ISIS and Al-Qaeda head who's being feted at the UN. The timing of that whole public relations stunt in New York should also be looked at closely, because that's also a big part of this story, because Syria is an important staging ground, or at least a pathway that Israel has for launching its own attacks. I think that's also how they will sell this in the United States, and it's how it started before, is Israel will attack, and then the United States will come and join them or bail them out, basically, because they can't do it themselves. So, I mean, that's probably going to happen again.
Yeah. We had Arab states at the UN condemning Israeli attack on Doha. And it seems that yesterday Netanyahu he called the Emir of Qatar during his talk with Donald Trump, and he apologized for what has happened. And are they intimidating these Arab states? Are they trying to manipulate them? How can we understand the behavior of these countries in terms of any sort of attack on Iran?
I think it's this is intimidation. So, I mean, what you have right now, just take Qatar as an example. Israel got away with launching an airstrike on Doha. I mean, I honestly, I couldn't see that coming. I thought that would have been a red line, because because the Qataris host a major U.S. military facility there, and that's totally pivotal to the U.S. presence in the region. So why would America risk that to allow Israel to act hitting a target in Doha? And that's a city also. People have to understand, when we talk about Doha, when we talk about Bahrain, and we talk about the UAE and Saudi Arabia as well, you can throw in here, that the inward investment into these countries, they're getting all kinds of direct foreign investment into the region. It's all predicated on stability and safety. That the money will not flow if they're deemed to be a target by anybody, including Israel. So is the Israelis really, did some damage there to this kind of force field that was always around the Emirates and Qatar. Okay, so what does that say? It says that the United States is not going to protect any of these. And so there's now an understanding in the region among Arab countries that before the U.S. and through the sort of normalization process, the Zionization of the Arab world had sold this idea that Iran was the biggest threat to the Gulf's Emirates and to the oil sheikdoms in the region. And that's no longer the case. Now Israel is regarded as the biggest threat to Arabs. That's among Arab countries. This is a consensus that has formed in the last year that I think is now. The New York Times even ran a headline this week, articulating, or late last week, articulating that very point. Okay, well, now what are the ramifications of that? The ramifications are that Qatar, it's not safe for them to host any Palestinian negotiations, delegations. That could draw attacks, and not just overhead drone attacks or Air Force attacks, but targeted assassinations, terrorist attacks by Israel. They've done all this before, by the way, so I'm sure they're prepared to do it again. And so now there's pressure being put on Egypt, that Egypt might host or might be facilitating negotiations. And there's a lot of pressure from the Egyptian public as well on the current regime, the al-Sisi regime. And so at the same time, and this is where it gets really interesting, Nima, at the same time, Israel begins making noises this last week that they're concerned, these are their words, they're concerned that Hamas militants, or Hamas terrorists as they call them, are crossing over into the Sinai, along with refugees and medical evacuees from Gaza. You see? So now they're building a narrative that there's a Hamas presence in the Sinai. And so this is exactly what happened in 1978 when the PLO was pushed out of Palestine into places like Lebanon, into Syria, into Lebanon, into Jordan, and into other countries, but specifically Lebanon. Israel used that as a pretext to attack, invade, and occupy South Lebanon for strategic reasons and security reasons in order to deal with the Palestinian or PLO issue in Lebanon. So that went for decades. That was 1978, stretched all the way till 2000, you could say. So over 20 years, and occupied a portion of South Lebanon, which was only forced to let go of the last main bits during the war with Hezbollah in 2006, I believe. I think it was 2006. I might have my date wrong on that. But so you see the same principles here, which is Israel can create situations in Jordan, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, in all of the surrounding countries, even in the Emirates. They can create situations where they say, we have a right to defend ourselves. We are going to target militarily to whatever degree in those countries. And so whether Egypt wants to be involved or not, they will be dragged into a conflict with Israel if Israel wants to do that. If they want to drag Egypt into that kind of a situation, they can and they will. And Egypt can't do anything about it. Egypt cannot, no one can strike Israel back because the overwhelming force, no one will restrain Israel. So who in their right mind, unless they're ready to go to war with Israel, and I mean go to war, Israel's a nuclear armed country. So you're looking at a really horrible situation in the region where Israel's threatened and blackmailed everybody in the region and the United States and Europe. And so they're hell-bent on realizing their, quote, greater Israel project, which isn't, Jews populating all these Arab countries, but subservient Arab client states around a much larger version of the current Israel you see. When I say much larger, full annexation of the West Bank, Jordan Valley, all of Gaza, South Lebanon, Golan Heights, Mount Hermon, maybe even further in parts of Iraq, perhaps Al-Tanf, maybe parts of Jordan, and even perhaps, parts of Saudi Arabia. Who knows where it would end? And the Sinai, of course, in Egypt. That's greater Israel, from the river to the sea. So they've made no secret that is their long-term objective. And so who's going to stand in the way of that? Who's going to, the only country that's capable of restraining them is Iran. But Iran is not an immediate neighbor to Israel. However, Iran can reach out and touch Israel very easily, and they can deter them, but at what cost? Did Israel issue a nuclear threat via Washington about what they would do with Iran, and then the U.S. felt compelled to end the so-called 12-day war through a conventional bombing strike because of a threat by Israel, a nuclear threat, what they would do? And so the U.S., of course, would want to, head off any kind of escalation that involves nuclear weapons in the region. So they would act and attack Iran in the way that they did to avoid an Israeli escalation, a nuclear escalation. Is that what happened in June? Because many have intimated that that was the case. We don't know. I don't know right now. I can't tell you for certain that was what happened. But if it is even remotely possible, like let's say it was 10% possible that happened, that is a seriously concerning thing, because it means that there's really no restraint for Israel, and that's hugely worrying.
I think it's a legitimate question to ask, how capable are these Arab states to defend themselves if they want to defend themselves? We saw what has happened in Doha. You see at least 15 fighter jets invading Saudi Arabia airspace and going to Qatar. You see nothing happening. And do you think it was a failure on their part, or they don't? I don't know how much they're capable of using the weapons that they bought for many years from the United States, and how are they really in charge of the weapons in Saudi Arabia, or someone else is just running the show?
I think the more and more people are realizing the answer to that question is, if you shop at Uncle Sam's military hardware store, you cannot. Uncle Sam will decide, right down to the bullet, what is to be used and what is not to be used. Certainly, these advanced systems, like even Israel, the Iron Dome, the first versions, the first iterations of the Iron Dome were all U.S. Patriot missile batteries run by U.S. servicemen. And all the training, the operations were all done out of Stuttgart, Germany. But it was marketed in the U.S. as the Iron Dome. And they showed it on Fox, and it was, oh, wow, look at the Iron Dome. It was all American. Everything was American. Even the people running it were American. It was only recently that Israel has devolved parts of it, large parts of it, so it is operated by Israelis. Okay, and they've done various modifications, but it's an integrated missile defense array that has different types of missiles in terms of the altitude of interception and so forth. And what's interesting, Nima, is that Israel has committed to offload the original Iron Dome, at 8 of those Patriot missile batteries. They're shipping them to Kiev, to Zelensky. So they've already sent one, at least, that I can say I could confirm. One of those have been shipped in the last 2 months, and with the pledge that the other decommissioned ones, or at least decommissioned in the sense that they're out of date in accordance to the new protocols, that Zelensky's going to get those U.S. So they're basically older U.S. Patriot missile systems, 30 years old, roughly. And that's interesting. And are they giving those for free? Are they selling those to the Ukrainians? And if they're selling them to the Ukrainians, they're not really selling them to the Ukrainians. They're selling them to the Americans or the Europeans who are paying for it. So Israel's taking more money from the U.S. by dumping their old stock on Ukraine. And that's only going to extend the conflict even further. So I wonder how Moscow feels about that. I'm sure Moscow's not happy about that. But by doing so, Israel's really just extending the conditions for the Ukraine conflict to continue, basically. So that should give you an idea of whose side Israel's on. I know Russia takes a very realist position with regards, a very nationalist, self-interested position with regards to who it engages in relations with. And certainly Israel falls into that category, not least of all, Russia's exposed in Tartus, heavily exposed in Tartus right now. So they're in a very, very tricky and precarious situation, the Russians. And this move by Israel is very, very inflammatory. And I think this, and if you look back at history, Nima, this has always been a problem for the Americans to dislodge the Russians from the Middle East. It's always been a problem. And periodically, wars have been fought, escalations have been set in motion in order to do that. Previous U.S. administrations have been involved in that effort, and Russia got a serious foothold in the region under Bashar al-Assad from October 2015 onwards. And they're in a very weak position right now. I'm sure there will be big celebration in Washington if they could dislodge Russia from Syria 100%. And there's probably a lot of people that would be happy about that in Europe and in the U.S. So that's something also to consider. That's another sort of dynamic in all of this.
I think what's important for Russia is this southern part of Russia and the Caucasus and the movement of these jihadis and these Salafis in that region. And today we've learned that high-rank Iranian government delegation made an unannounced visit to Moscow. It could be related to the conflict, to what's going on in the Middle East. And Patrick, when you look at the behavior of Donald Trump and his administration, they came in simply saying that they don't want war. They want something else. They want a better America, make America great again. You see the Department of Defense has changed, the name has changed to Department of War. Pete Hegseth, in this meeting he had with the generals, he said that if you want peace, you have to be prepared for war. And Donald Trump calling Russia a paper tiger, simply, it's amazing what's going on. And the guy, you look at his podcast before being elected in the United States, he said, why are we having a continuous conflict with Iran and Russia? And why are we not capable to do something to make a deal with them? They're killing the dollar, that we have to choose a different path. But he's doing the same as we saw with the Biden administration. So these people, these leaders in Russia and Iran are looking at the situation. So what has changed? Nothing, even getting worse.
Yeah, nothing's materially changed. It's status quo from the Biden administration. They're talking about, I think it's J.D. Vance saying, "Oh, we're looking at sending Tomahawk missiles to the Ukraine," and so that's a signal to Moscow. See, America thinks, "Oh, we're going to up the ante in negotiations by upping the threats." They think, "Okay, we'll up the threats. We'll turn up the heat." And we're going to get concessions from Russia. I mean, I'm thinking, is this the logic they're using? Because if it is, of course, that can't succeed with another superpower, another nuclear armed superpower. Russia would just continue on with conventional warfare, at which point they have a huge and decided advantage over NATO and anything the U.S. can throw into the cauldron in Ukraine. So what's it going to achieve? Just an extended conflict. Now, but you have to get into the mentality of the Europeans, okay? And especially the mentality of the British. From a military point of view, and I think a lot of the Europeans are all the junior NATO partners. So the U.S., Britain, that's NATO, and everything else is a junior partner. France, slightly higher than the rest of the junior partners, and Norway has certainly increased its position, as has Germany recently. But in terms of fighting forces, combat, logistics, and all of that, it's the U.S. and Britain really, and everything else I think is just an afterthought. So they believe that technology, that drone swarming, I'm talking about the British, that given enough time, they'll be able to hit a few more benchmarks in RMA benchmarks, Revolution in Military Affairs benchmarks, drone warfare being one of those, AI autonomous drone warfare, i.e., drones that don't need to be tethered either by GPS networks or even by fiber optics, but drones that can fly autonomous missions, that they'll be able to overwhelm a country like Russia and even be used for decapitation strikes or to paralyze the government and create such chaos in the large cities, and so they're really terrorizing Russia through technology, different levels of attack, from cyber to physical drone warfare, and they think that with enough time, even though Ukraine is getting absolutely smashed on the battlefield, and even though Ukraine probably is not going to be able to field any kind of a meaningful infantry force to cover even a small percentage of the positions needed to hold the current front line in Ukraine, that given enough time, that this won't be an issue because they can somehow collapse the regime in Moscow and then achieve victory that way. They really believe, and there's a lot of inertia in industry that has promised this is the case. And so this kind of hysterical thinking, they really believe that they're going to win. And if you notice something, Donald Trump's major U-turn this last week on Ukraine, you saw the tweets he put out, totally insane, that Ukraine's going to take back all of the new regions in Donbass, plus more, he said, whatever that means. Is he talking about Crimea? Is he talking about parts of Russia? Who knows? But when did this happen? This came, I initially thought this was after he had met with Zelensky on the sidelines at the United Nations address in General Assembly, but that wasn't it. This came after his state visit to Great Britain and his big royal visit laid on by King Charles. And so Trump was basically gang tackled in the UK by British intelligence, Keir Starmer, the royal family, and a few other operatives there, and in which point they pumped into his brain this idea that Russia was losing, the Russian economy is on the edge of failure, that they're about to turn the corner with wonder weapons, and that the Ukrainians are just need a little bit more support, and they're going to be able to do the job. The same type of talking points we've seen for the last 3 years that we've been taking on the Ukraine thing. So, but it was Britain. It's Britain. Britain's always been there to whip and discipline the United States on this issue, especially, and they continue to do that. They continue to dazzle Trump. And look, that's what all that was for. That's what that state banquet was for. 150 horses, cavalry, guardsmen. No U.S. president had ever been given the royal treatment like Donald Trump was. And that's quite extraordinary if you consider previous U.S. presidents. And also considering the fact that the Trump-British relationship, it's tenuous at best, seeing that it was British intelligence operatives that supplied the Steele dossier that began the effort to basically take out this president in his first term as a quote Russian agent. But what was the reason for that? The reason for that maybe wasn't so much as to take out Trump under the fake Russiagate hoax, but to discipline Trump, to make Trump into an anti-Russian president. And he was an anti-Russian president, and he supplied lethal aid to the Ukrainians during his first term, and he raised sanctions. He expelled diplomats. So all of these techniques work on someone like Trump, who is just completely obsessed with his public how the public perceive him, how he's perceived in the media, how he's perceived by his allies, and so forth. And so they've learned how to play Trump, and they're playing him really well right now. Look at the European leaders, sycophantic European leaders, buttering up Trump, calling him daddy, saying yes to basically everything. Ursula von der Leyen, she said we're gonna give $600 billion in European investment by 2028 to Donald Trump. I mean, you have to be so naive to have swallowed this, Because why did she say 2028? Because Trump's out of office in 2028. So they don't have to invest anything. And they said, yes, we're going to do 5% of our GDP spend on NATO. Don't worry. And Donald Trump comes back, does a victory lapse. I got everything I wanted from the Europeans. They haven't delivered anything. They're not going to get a 5% GDP spend for defense spending to build up or bulk up the NATO, at least on paper. It's not going to happen. Nor are the Europeans going to spend nearly what they committed to spend on defense and on buying U.S. Kit and all this gear. It's not going to happen. This is all talk. And so, but we're in this political realm right now where everybody's trying to get from A to B. And so that's why I'm just kind of waiting to see how this is going to pan out, because there's a lot of posturing, there's a lot of talk, and you have to, Trump, if you go by everything he promises and says, and if you took him at his word every week, I mean, you'd be going crazy, you'd be going insane by now, because you'd have to do 180s and pivot back and retrench every week. So I've given up with this president. I don't believe a word he says. Nothing he says is set in stone. Everything is arbitrary. Everything is flexible. Everything is basically, I think he really says what he feels will get him till the end of the week. I really believe that's what this president, and he does this every week. And guess what happens? Nothing actually happens. Nothing actually gets achieved. Nothing gets achieved in Gaza. Nothing gets achieved in Ukraine. Nothing gets achieved anywhere else. So to your original point, Nima, how you opened up the conversation, the president campaigned and promised these big things, big achievements, and America got behind him, backed him, voted for him, and he hasn't delivered on anything, not even close. He's given us photo ops and a few good feel-good moments. He's given us a dopamine rush in Alaska when he had the Russian delegation. We all got a nice dopamine rush saying, oh, peace is possible. Of course, it's always possible. But is it probable? Or is it even practical now for all parties? And the answer, of course, is no. So, that's where we're at with this president. So if the U.S. isn't going to achieve anything, who is? Look off to the side, slightly off stage, Israel. Israel's getting what it wants. Let's look at the other parties here. Russia's also getting a lot of what it wants from the conflict in Ukraine, slowly but surely. And the Americans are reading that. And if you look at the statements from J.D. Vance, and Russia has to face it, they haven't got any territory after 3 years. Russia's not steamrolling Ukraine after territory. But the fact that the Americans can't articulate this and don't understand that Russia knows they can't kill civilians if they plan on governing that area in the future. I mean, it's like common sense for a Russian, but for an American, this is a foreign concept, because Americans don't fight their wars like that. They don't care. They don't care who they kill. They don't, and certainly Israel doesn't. They don't care what happens to that country if it's wrecked for the next 30 years. They really don't care. And they'll rinse it out with reconstruction contracts like they did in Iraq, and they don't care if any reconstruction actually happens. That's the American mindset. It's just a feeding frenzy. You do the war, and then you have the feeding frenzy for reconstruction. They're hoping to do this with Syria, but it hasn't quite panned out, at least not quick enough. And then Lebanon, look at what the United States is doing with Lebanon. Tom Barak is Trump's envoy. He was originally ambassador to Turkey, and in typical Trump fashion, he's been promoted to do like 5 other things, including being the sort of emissary from the king to the Lebanese. And he's basically openly touting for a civil war in Lebanon, openly. He's saying we're going to arm the Lebanese armed forces and need to disarm Hezbollah. And we're not going to give any arms to the country unless they're going to be used against Hezbollah. That's a civil war. That's a U.S. envoy openly canvassing for a civil war in Lebanon on behalf of the Israelis. So, I mean, and what's even incredible about this, Nima, is there's not a Democrat Not a Democrat that will stand up and oppose this on principle. This is just in violation of every single U.S. norm, diplomatic norm ever in history. And it's all coming apart. And the potential for instability in the Middle East as a result of this, and of course, Israel is very happy about that instability because it knows exactly what it will do and what it will achieve should things destabilize more. The potential is now an unprecedented level, unprecedented. And so that's where the Trump administration has brought us. The question is, can we pull back from the brink?
Yeah. In the case of Tomahawk, that they're talking about sending them to Israel, to Ukraine, I think looking at the behavior of the Trump administration with the attack on nuclear bombers in Russia, that was a huge intelligence and operation in Russia that I I have never thought that the Biden administration would let Ukrainians to do that, to go that far. You remember Starmer going to the United States asking Joe Biden to give them long range missiles. The Pentagon those days said no. That's a huge escalation. But they're talking about Tomahawk, capable of carrying nuclear bombs with a range of 1,000 miles, which would be 1.6 or 1,600 kilometers. These are huge escalations in the conflict in Ukraine. If they use them against Russia, that would bring the Brezhnev moment that we were talking about. And Russia, by the way, Lavrov said at the UN that they're going to hit these European countries who are providing Ukraine with the weapons. They're not going to sit and see what's going on with the case of Ukraine. How do you see that? How do you see are we heading toward escalation? Because the way that they're picturing the situation, looking at JD Vance, I thought that he's the sanest character in the Trump administration, but it seems that he's just losing everything.
Yeah, I just on the JD Vance point, I had a lot of hope. A lot of people had a lot of hope for him because he seemed to be the most high IQ, most intelligent person in there. It's almost like people thought, oh, he was selected as vice president to be Trump's better half intellectually, and then he would play that role. But what's happened is, and this always happens, okay, always happens to especially vice president. So traditionally, the vice president will sit at the head of the National Security Council. Traditionally, so they then are tasked with running point on coups, illegal regime change wars, which Mike Pence was during the first term of Trump. Mike Pence front ran all the failed coups in Venezuela. You remember there was two of them, and then he had Elliot Abrams and some of these neocon retread dinosaurs or Nosferatu type characters coming out of the basement of Foggy Bottom, like John Bolton and Elliot Abrams, and it was a total failure. But Mike Pence basically played that role of just kind of rubber stamping these types of operations. So JD Vance, I don't think he would be given that much. They wouldn't devolve that much power to the vice president under Trump, simply because Trump's management pyramid is that there's nobody that could be his equal or that could challenge him from politically, intellectually, or from a popularity point of view. It's just not allowed. So Trump will surround himself by people that are, Vance is only 42 years old. So he's 40 or 42. He's extremely young, way too young to be vice president, because whoever you select as vice president, you have to assume that they will be president should something happen to the president. So the last two selections of Kamala Harris and JD Vance, I think is kind of, a little bit irresponsible, but it also means that if they are to assume power, that they will be weak. And so who will then take over is everybody around them. And so certainly that happened with the Biden presidency as he was suffering from early onset dementia. And that was quite visible even from the first days of his administration, that the White House is being run by Ron Klein and all these other nefarious Democratic globalist operatives in the Biden administration. Trump has some similar characters around him that would revel at the opportunity to take over the White House and take over policy. But the problem with people like Vance is, again, I had a lot of hope for him, but they all basically turn into this tool, basically. And I have not heard an original thought coming out of Vance's head. I don't think these people study very well. They think they understand some concepts because someone they think was smart told them something. But they're talking about, they're talking about re-evaluating their relationship with Europe. This has been a big theme this year. Re-evaluate our relationship with Europe, rebalancing their relationship with Europe. But they don't really understand. It's not just about, and Vance stood at the Munich Security Conference, if you remember, in February, and basically chastised the Europeans, saying, you're not following democratic values by arresting people for tweeting things you don't like and so forth. Meanwhile, the United States, with Marco Rubio running front running, are kidnapping students off the street with guys with hooded balaclavas working for the government for writing op-eds in a student newspaper in support of Palestine, and then threatening to deport and deporting people who are protesting, exercising their First Amendment. I mean, forget about it. So it's rich of J.D. Vance to be lecturing the Europeans on democratic values when the Trump administration has launched more full frontal attacks on the First Amendment, most recently the Attorney General threatening to arrest anyone that she deemed was guilty of hate speech or said something unkind about Charlie Kirk after his death. And then they'll lock people up and they'll deport them or whatever. If they criticize Israel, they'll strip their citizenship. I don't know how crazy the threats got from the likes of Rubio. So someone like Vance, who would assume the royal presidency should anything to happen to Donald Trump, he's sending very bad signals because it's all about politics. It's not about principle, and it's certainly not about the Constitution. And that's the thing that I think worries a lot of Americans. And Donald Trump's going to lose that swing vote. The Republicans will lose that swing vote because they basically abandon the constitutional principles in favor of political power, and specifically in favor of protecting Israeli interests, a foreign power. So they've allowed a foreign power to come in to get the U.S. government to attack its own institutions, attack its constitution, attack the United Nations, attack international conventions and treaties. It's done the same with the UK and Europe, attack the rule of law, and obliterate the international courts of justice and international, the Geneva Convention, all of these important institutions after the Second World War designed to prevent the very things that we're seeing happen right now. So instead of helping to prevent them, the United States is enabling them. Britain's enabling them. They're enabling genocide. They're enabling a new Holocaust in Gaza by supporting the Israelis, and are prepared to dismantle all of the democratic institutions and structures to protect Israel. It's kind of insane, actually, but that's exactly what we're witnessing right now.
Yeah. Actually, according to a recent New York Times survey, it shows that 7 in 10 American voters under 30 oppose additional economic and military aid to Israel. I think what has happened during the movement, Charlie Kirk's movement, and Turning Point USA, and you can understand totally why they're trying to just overtake the movement. The guy who is replacing Charlie Kirk, I don't know if you've heard the way he's talking about Israel. He's totally pro-Israel, and he's pointing out the Republican Party point of view on woke and all of these things that they usually talk about it. But the main point is the support to Israel. And I don't know, it's 7 in 10 American, under 30. It's a lot. They cannot reshape this. They cannot change it.
No, it's a very dark period. And, the problem is and I've said this previously, I knew this was going to happen, is that I'll take the Democrats and the liberals as an example in America. They spent the last 10 years, basically, even before Donald Trump was sworn into office, they spent the last 10 years accusing Trump of being a fascist, even before he did any executive order or passed any laws or anything. And he was definitely on his back heels the first term completely. And then he was attacked with lawfare and all these other things during Biden's term to prevent him, ostensibly anywhere, at least it appeared to be, to prevent him from running in 2024. But he didn't actually do anything fascistic. Okay. And January 6th, it was a very much an FBI-driven hoax in itself. And of course, the facts are now coming out about that. And just the huge influx of Biden FBI agents and informants that were running the crowds on January 6th, basically, in order to create a Reichstag type, a Reichstag light type event that allowed Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats to enact martial law in DC and to pursue all of the sort of MAGA people arrested and tried by the thousands, held in federal court and so forth. So, but Trump didn't actually get to do the fascism. Now, in his second term, he's actually doing the fascism. He's deploying troops, multiple U.S. cities. He is tearing up the Constitution. He's running roughshod over everything and making threats, starting wars, backing a genocide. I mean, it's not a good first 9 months for this president, but there's no pushback from the Democrats. Almost nothing. If you think about that, that itself is actually incredible. So just the cowardice from the Democrats and liberals that they can't muster anything because their initial attacks on Trump were not based on principle as much as they didn't like him, or is based on propaganda and fake news of him being a Russian agent, which was fake. And now they've shot all their bullets. There's nothing left in the chamber, and they can't do anything to stop them. And they won't oppose Israel. So we have the worst of both worlds right now.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always, talking to you.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Nima.
Have a great time there.
You too.
Bye-bye.